94 years before Iceland proved the four-day workweek could function at national scale, a Cambridge economist named John Maynard Keynes predicted exactly why you'd still resist it. He got the timeline spectacularly wrong, but the psychological warfare, the moral panic, and the precise arguments your coworker uses against shorter hours in the break room were all there in his 1930 essay, Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, which reads less like economic theory and more like a diagnostic manual for the debates consuming LinkedIn right now. Most people know Keynes as the government spending guy, the Great Depression architect, the economist conservatives blame for deficits, and progressives misquote at dinner parties. That's like knowing Einstein only as the relativity guy and missing that he predicted gravitational waves a century before we detected them. Keynes's most radical prediction had nothing to do with fiscal policy and everything to do with time, specifically how much of it you'd spend working and why you'd probably keep doing it even when you didn't have to. King's College, Cambridge, 1928. Keynes sat drafting what he considered a minor lecture for a small audience, while the world drifted 2 years away from economic catastrophe and stock markets hit euphoric peaks. His subject was grandchildren, not his own since he never had any, but yours and mine, people who would be alive in 2030. The prediction was mathematically audacious. Within 100 years, he argued, the economic problem of basic survival, of securing enough food and shelter, would be solved. Technology would multiply human productivity so dramatically that by 2030, we'd only need to work 15 hours a week, not as utopian fantasy, but as simple arithmetic. If productivity keeps compounding and basic needs stay roughly constant, work hours must decline, and the math is inescapable. Keynes wasn't theorizing in a vacuum. Just 2 years before his Cambridge lecture, Henry Ford had shocked the industrial world by cutting his automotive plants to a 40-hour, 5-day week. The business establishment predicted disaster and Ford's competitors called it reckless, but what actually happened was that productivity climbed and absenteeism dropped. The 5-day week spread across American manufacturing within a decade. Keynes watched this unfold and understood that Ford had demonstrated something most economists missed, which is that the relationship between hours and output isn't linear. At some point, more hours produce less value. Economists now call the period Keynes was writing in the Great Productivity Surge. Between 1870 and 1930, output per worker in Britain had roughly doubled as factories mechanized, electricity transformed manufacturing, and assembly lines multiplied human effort. If that trend continued, and Keynes saw no economic reason it wouldn't, his grandchildren would inhabit a world where scarcity was a solved problem. The factories would run themselves, the farms would need barely any hands, and the question wouldn't be how do we produce enough, but what do we do with all this free time? Keynes wasn't alone in seeing this future. That same decade, Bertrand Russell, one of the 20th century's most influential philosophers, was writing In Praise of Idleness and making the philosophical case for what Keynes framed economically. Two of Britain's most formidable minds simultaneously diagnosed the same coming crisis. Russell argued that the morality of work was propaganda designed by the powerful to keep the productive classes docile, while Keynes argued it was psychological programming that would outlive its usefulness. Same diagnosis, different vocabulary, and here's where Keynes diverges from simple techno-optimism, because he didn't think this transition would be smooth. He predicted with uncomfortable precision the exact psychological crisis we're living through right now. His essay contains a line that reads like prophecy. For the first time since his creation, Keynes wrote, man will be faced with his real, his permanent problem, how to use his freedom from pressing economic cares, how to occupy the leisure which science and compound interest will have won for him, to live wisely and agreeably and well. That sounds aspirational, but Keynes immediately followed it with something darker. He predicted that most people would fail this test, and that we'd experience what he called a nervous breakdown of civilization, as we lost the organizing principle that had structured human life for millennia, which is the necessity of work. He identified a psychological phenomenon that wouldn't have a clinical name for another 90 years. He called them those who have been trained too long to strive and not to enjoy, people who had internalized labor as identity, people who would immediately try to fill any leisure with more work, not because they needed the money, but because they needed the meaning. What Keynes described is what psychologists now call effort justification, the cognitive bias that makes you value things more because they cost you. 20 years of 60-hour weeks isn't just time spent, it's identity capital. The 4-day workweek doesn't just threaten your schedule, it threatens to bankrupt the psychological investment you've made in believing those hours mattered. The broader term for this phenomenon is workism, and it wasn't coined until 2019 when Derek Thompson wrote, "Workism is making Americans miserable for the Atlantic," essentially rediscovering what Keynes diagnosed during the Hoover administration. Workism is the belief that work is not merely necessary for income, but essential for dignity, identity, and moral worth. Keynes saw it coming, he just didn't have the branding. Now here's how Keynes's psychological prediction maps onto the 4-day workweek fight happening in boardrooms and legislatures right now. Keynes's 15-hour week never materialized. By 2024, the average American works approximately 38.7 hours weekly, and professionals in finance, law, and technology routinely log 50 or 60. We're nowhere near his prediction. But here's the thing, Keynes's productivity math was actually correct. Economic output per hour worked has increased roughly 5-fold since 1930 across most developed economies. We produce vastly more per hour than our great-grandparents could have imagined. If we'd held consumption constant at 1,930 levels and converted all that productivity gain into leisure, 8 hours a week is all we'd need to work right now. We could have had Keynes's utopia, but we chose more stuff instead. Bigger houses, more vehicles, faster devices, streaming subscriptions, food delivery. All the things that make a 2024 lifestyle look like science fiction to someone from 1,930 but require 2,024 work hours to afford. That outcome wasn't inevitable. It was chosen, or more precisely, it was coordinated. And this is where Keynes's prediction becomes operational, because the 4-day workweek isn't primarily an economic problem, it's a game theory problem. Economists call it the coordination dilemma. Individually, almost no worker wants to be the person asking for Fridays off, because you'll look uncommitted, you'll miss meetings, and you'll be the first layoff when cuts come. Collectively, survey after survey shows most workers want shorter weeks. Everyone's trapped in a game where the individually rational move, keep working 5 days, produces a collectively irrational outcome where everyone's exhausted and no one has the time they want. A New Zealand company called Perpetual Guardian ran an experiment in 2018 that solved this coordination problem by fiat. Andrew Barnes, the founder, had read research suggesting workers are genuinely productive for about 3 hours daily while the rest is meetings, email, and performative busyness. What if a company simply admitted that? And what if everyone got Friday off simultaneously with no individual negotiation required? The experiment didn't just test productivity, it tested whether collective coordination could break the game theory trap. And it worked. Productivity didn't decline, but rose marginally. Employee stress dropped 7%, work-life balance satisfaction jumped 24%, revenue held steady. Barnes hadn't just offered a perk, he'd solved a coordination puzzle that had trapped workers for decades. Microsoft Japan replicated it in 2019 when they gave 2,300 employees every Friday off for a month. Productivity increased 40%, electricity costs dropped 23%, and paper usage dropped 59%, because apparently having less time makes you waste less time on pointless documents. Iceland ran the world's largest trial of reduced work hours between 2015 and 2019. Over 2,500 workers, about 1% of the country's entire workforce, moved to 35 or 36-hour weeks with no pay reduction. The trial spanned offices, hospitals, schools, and social service providers. The British think tank Autonomy and Icelandic researcher Gudmundur Haraldsson analyzed the results and found productivity holding steady or improving in nearly every workplace, while worker well-being improved substantially. By 2022, 86% of Iceland's workforce had either moved to shorter hours or gained the contractual right to negotiate for them. The data kept accumulating. The organization 4-Day Week Global, founded by Barnes and entrepreneur Charlotte Lockhart, coordinated a 6-month pilot across 61 UK companies in 2022. Juliet Shaw, a Boston College economist who has studied work hours for 3 decades, analyzed the results and found that revenue stayed essentially flat while employee resignations dropped 57%, burnout decreased, and sick days decreased. When the trial ended, 56 of 61 companies chose to continue the 4-day week permanently. The World Economic Forum made the future of work a permanent agenda item at Davos, treating what Keynes predicted as civilization's defining challenge. Belgium passed a law in 2022 allowing workers to compress hours into 4 days. Spain began experimenting with government-subsidized reduced hours. And Japan, the country that invented karoshi, the word for death from overwork, started actively promoting the 4-day week as public health policy. If you only looked at data, the debate should be over. The trials show it works. Companies that try it don't revert. Employees are happier and equivalently productive. Costs don't increase. And yet fierce opposition remains. The argument against the 4-day workweek is exactly what Keynes predicted, which is morality dressed as economics. The opposition rhetoric almost never engages the trial data directly. Instead, it invokes a set of beliefs Keynes identified in 1930, that work is inherently good for character, regardless of output, that leisure corrupts, that people will become lazy and decadent and morally undeserving if not kept busy, that the purpose of labor isn't just production but discipline. This is the nervous breakdown Keynes predicted, not a breakdown caused by too much leisure, but a breakdown caused by the prospect of leisure, a breakdown of meaning. What Keynes diagnosed psychologically, the sociologist Max Weber had diagnosed theologically 2 decades earlier. Weber published The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism in 1905 and traced modern work culture to Calvinist theology. For the Calvinists, Weber argued, worldly success was evidence of divine election. Hard work wasn't just economically rational, it was spiritually necessary. Idleness wasn't just unproductive, it was sinful. Weber traced this belief to 16th century Geneva, while Keynes traced it to compound interest. Same cultural programming, different origin stories, and this is why the 4-day workweek feels so threatening to its opponents. It isn't a policy proposal, but a trailer for a future most people haven't emotionally processed. A future where what do you do stops being the most interesting question at parties. A future where identity has to come from somewhere other than your job title and your exhaustion. 3 specific mechanisms Keynes identified in 1930 map directly onto today's resistance. The first is technological unemployment, the idea that machines replacing human labor would create not just economic disruption but existential terror. Factories were automating in 1930 and workers were being displaced. The fear wasn't merely about income, it was about purpose. If machines can do what you do, what are you for? That fear never disappeared but shape-shifted instead. The 4-day workweek debate is haunted by the same specter today. If we can produce equivalent output in 4 days that once required 5, what does that reveal about all those hours we've been spending? And were they always unnecessary? Were we always, in some sense, performing work rather than doing it? The psychological threat isn't that the 4-day week might fail, but that it might succeed. Success would expose how much modern work was always performance, always bureaucratic theater. Always what anthropologist David Graeber called bullshit jobs in his 2018 book. These are roles that exist not to produce value, but to give people something to do, something to be. Keynes predicted this revelation would be too threatening for most people to accept. They'd fight shorter hours not because the economics failed, but because the philosophy terrified them. Anyone who's spent 4 decades working 50-hour weeks doesn't want to hear that half those hours were organizational padding. The second mechanism is what Keynes called the moral economics of time. His essay describes the transformation of the rentier, the person who lives on investment income without laboring. The 19th century recognized this as a legitimate social class, including landed gentry and trust fund beneficiaries, people who didn't need to work and therefore didn't. By the 20th century, this class had become morally suspect. Not working, even when unnecessary, became shameful. This moral shift matters because the 4-day workweek isn't about having less work to do, but about doing the same work in less time. But moral economics doesn't process that distinction. The fear operates at a symbolic level where fewer hours signifies lower moral worth. Listen to opposition rhetoric with fresh ears. People need to work. Shorter hours breed laziness. We didn't build this country on 3-day weekends. These aren't arguments about productivity data, but arguments about character. They assume work's value lies not in what it produces, but in what it costs, the hours sacrificed, the sweat expended, the leisure foregone. Keynes identified this precisely when he wrote that we have been trained too long to strive and not to enjoy. The key word is trained. This isn't human nature expressing itself, but human culture installed over centuries. The four-day work week triggers the security system. The third mechanism is what Keynes delicately called the problem of leisure. He predicted that most people, given genuine free time, would have no idea what to do with it. Not from lack of imagination, but from lack of preparation. Nothing in their education, their culture, or their economic system had equipped them for unstructured time. Consider the asymmetry. Entire industries, including education, training, professional development, and performance management, are dedicated to preparing people for work. Almost no infrastructure exists to prepare people for not work. Someone who retires at 65 and lives to 85 receives 20 years of time they spent zero time learning to use. The result for many retirees is depression, purposelessness, and accelerated mortality. Studies consistently show that early retirement without meaningful activity correlates with earlier death. Keynes thought this problem would become catastrophic at civilizational scale. He imagined a world where productivity had outpaced meaning-making, where the machines hummed efficiently and humans sat anxious and unmoored, desperately inventing justifications for busyness. And this is why the four-day workweek generates such disproportionate resistance. It's not a policy debate, but a preview of a future most people haven't emotionally rehearsed, a future where identity must source itself from somewhere beyond labor. But here's where Keynes missed something. He framed the leisure problem as individual, as though each person would need to learn separately how to construct meaning without work. What he underestimated was the collective dimension. The reason the four-day workweek succeeds in trials isn't just because individual workers prefer it, but because it transforms the social contract. When everyone in an organization shares the same day off, the choice becomes normal. The shame evaporates. The coordination problem solves itself through policy rather than individual negotiation. National legislation matters more than company-by-company adoption for exactly this reason. In countries like Belgium, which passed its 2022 law allowing compressed schedules, the shift becomes cultural rather than personal. It stops being a perk to request and starts being a norm to expect. The moral economics invert. Instead of asking why you only work 4 days, the question becomes why are you still working 5? The four-day workweek advocates who understand this, including Barnes, Lockhart, and Shaw, have stopped making purely economic arguments and started making coordination arguments. The data supports shorter weeks, and the obstacle is the game theory. The solution is collective action that changes defaults rather than individual choices that fight them. This produces a generational dimension Keynes didn't anticipate. Workers who entered the labor force after 2010 carried different expectations than those who entered in 1980. Millennials and Gen Z workers prioritize flexibility and time over pure compensation more than previous generations did at similar ages, according to surveys. And this isn't because younger workers are lazier, since productivity data doesn't support that interpretation. They've absorbed a different set of defaults about what work should demand. The result is a generational flashpoint. Keynes predicted in structure, but not in specifics. Workers who invested 40 years in 50-hour weeks often perceive younger workers' boundaries as entitlement. Younger workers often perceive that resistance as Stockholm syndrome. Both groups are responding logically to the norms they were trained under. The four-day workweek makes this tension explicit. So what did Keynes figure out in 1930 that labor economists, corporate executives, and policymakers are still absorbing today? The obstacle to shorter work hours isn't economic, and it never was. The productivity gains that could fund Keynes's 15-hour week arrived decades ago. We chose, or were coordinated into choosing, to convert those gains into consumption rather than leisure. The four-day workweek asks whether we might choose differently going forward. The resistance to that choice isn't rational in any simple sense, but psychological and cultural and moral. It emerges from centuries of conditioning that Keynes named and Max Weber traced, and David Graeber satirized. Work has become identity. Busyness has become virtue. Leisure has become suspect. The four-day workweek doesn't fail because the economics don't work. It struggles to spread because the economics work too well, revealing that much of what we called necessary work was always negotiable, always partly performance, always in some uncomfortable sense optional. The best argument against the four-day workweek isn't productivity data. It's the terror of answering honestly what you are if you're not your job. Keynes predicted that question would paralyze us. The trial data suggests it doesn't have to, and that given the chance, most people find the answer readily enough. The obstacle is getting that chance simultaneously rather than individually. The obstacle is coordination. Keynes gave us a deadline of 2030, which is now 4 years away. His productivity, arithmetic, and his psychological prediction may finally converge, or we may prove him right about what we could achieve, and right about why we'll resist achieving it. The best framework for understanding the 4-day workweek fight isn't coming from policy papers or productivity consultants. It's coming from a dead economist who understood human psychology better than most psychologists, and economic coordination better than most game theorists. You just didn't have the vocabulary for it until now. Economics and existential psychology seem like they occupy different buildings on the university campus, but the underlying structures connect everywhere. The math of productivity links to the terror of purposelessness. The arithmetic of compound interest links to the sociology of meaning. Those hidden architectures between fields that pretend to be strangers are what we explore here.